In 1692, an earthquake swallowed 2/3 of the wickedest city on Earth in under 3 minutes, and the ruins are still sitting upright on the seafloor, frozen at exactly 11:43 in the morning. That's not even the strangest thing hiding in Jamaica. This is an island with a mineral spa so radioactive that guests are legally limited to 20 minutes at a time. A mountain village that still calls itself a sovereign nation, separate from the government of Jamaica. And a neighborhood in the capital where, in 2010, the army rolled in with armored vehicles to hunt one man and left with a body count that Jamaicans are still arguing about today. Some of these places are locked down because they're sacred, some because they're toxic, and some because of what happened there. 25 restricted areas in Jamaica. Let's dive in. Number 25. Milk River Bath. In the parish of Clarendon, on the quiet south coast, sits a government-run spa built in 1794 around a spring that is, according to Jamaican official measurements, one of the most radioactive bodies of water on the planet. The Jamaica Information Service puts its radioactivity at 16 millicuries per liter, which multiple sources place at roughly 50 times the radioactivity of the famous spa waters at Vichy, France, and more than 50 times that of Baden in Switzerland. Because of this, bathers are restricted by policy to short soaking sessions, typically capped around 15 to 20 minutes, no more than 3 times a day. Legend says the spring was first discovered by an enslaved man who was beaten nearly to death, crawled into the woods to die, and came back healed. Whether or not you believe that part, the radioactivity is real, it's measured, and it's why nobody is allowed to just sit in that water all day. Number 24. Rose Hall Great House. Just outside Montego Bay stands an 18th century Georgian plantation mansion built by the Palmer family, and its basement has been converted into a bar people now visit specifically to feel unsettled. According to island legend, Mistress Annie Palmer, the so-called White Witch, murdered several husbands and countless lovers here using poison and allegedly voodoo learned in Haiti before being killed by one of her enslaved lovers. Her above-ground tomb was reportedly carved with a cross on only 3 of its 4 sides, which locals say is exactly why her spirit was never able to fully rest. The dungeon beneath the house, where enslaved people were once held, is now a themed pub serving a cocktail called the Witch's Brew. Night tours run a few evenings a week, and guides will tell you the ghost sightings didn't stop when the tour company started. Number 23. Black River Great Morass. On Jamaica's south coast, the Black River winds through the largest freshwater wetland on the island, a 125 square mile tangle of mangroves that is legally off limits to hunting because it's the last real stronghold of the American crocodile in Jamaica. These crocodiles are fully protected under the Wildlife Protection Act, but that hasn't stopped a black market for crocodile meat from taking root, and Jamaica's National Environment and Planning Agency has repeatedly flagged poaching as a growing threat to the population. Game wardens now patrol during the rainy months when crocodiles are most likely to wander from the morass into populated areas. Tour boats bring in an estimated 70,000 visitors a year specifically to see the crocodiles from a safe distance, which means an entire local tourism economy depends on protecting an apex predator that most countries would rather be rid of. Number 22. Hellshire Hills south of Kingston. Across a stretch of brutal dry limestone forest lives the very last wild population of the Jamaican iguana, an animal the world declared extinct in 1948. In 1990, a hog hunter's dog cornered a live adult male in a hollow log, and scientists realized the species had survived undetected for over 40 years in roughly 4 square miles of thorny, waterless terrain. Fewer than 200 individuals are believed to remain in the wild today. Conservationists now run a Head Start program at Hope Zoo in Kingston, hand-raising hatchlings until they're too big for mongooses to kill, then hauling them back into Hellshire by bus, boat, and on foot for release. The forest is legally protected, but illegal charcoal burning keeps chewing away at the 2 nesting sites the entire species now depends on to survive. Number 21. Vernam Field. In 1941, under the Destroyers for Bases Agreement between Britain and the United States, the U.S. Army Air Forces carved an airbase out of the bush in Clarendon Parish, complete with a 6,000-foot concrete runway. Vernam Field patrolled for German U-boats, refueled B-29 Superfortress's flying training routes from Kansas and Nebraska, and even hosted a wartime radar and weather station. When it closed in 1949 due to budget cuts, the buildings were torn down and the site was simply left to rot. For decades, it sat derelict, reclaimed by Bush, with only a local racetrack using the old runways. In 2008, the Jamaican government floated a plan to move the entire Jamaica Defense Force headquarters here from Kingston and turn it into the island's 4th international airport. That plan has been coming soon for well over a decade, and the old wartime tarmac is still mostly empty. Number 20. Up Park Camp in the heart of Kingston sits 220 acres of restricted military ground that has been a garrison since 1784, when the British War Department bought the land specifically because so many of its soldiers were dying of yellow fever elsewhere on the island. It didn't help much. Mortality among the British garrison here was so severe that troops eventually had to be relocated to a cooler post high in the Blue Mountains just to survive. Since Jamaican independence in 1962, Up Park Camp has served as the headquarters of the Jamaica Defense Force, housing the regiment, the engineering corps, the air wing, and a working military heliport right in the middle of a residential capital city. Civilians can visit a small military museum near the gate, but the rest of the 220 acres is a live command post, and you don't wander past the checkpoint. Number 19. Flat Bridge, Bogwalk Gorge. Between Kingston and the north coast runs a narrow limestone gorge carved by the Rio Cobre, and at its heart sits a one-lane, railing-free bridge that locals will tell you not to test after heavy rain. When the river rises, water floods directly over the deck, and the government's Water Resources Authority has documented real loss of life among drivers who tried to cross anyway. An automated flood early warning system now physically closes gates across the road whenever the water hits a critical threshold, and tampering with those gates is a prosecutable offense. In 2024 and 2025 alone, the gorge was shut down repeatedly by tropical storms, landslides blocking over 90% of the road in one incident. It's a functioning highway that the government has to be ready to seal off at a moment's notice, because people keep trying to beat the river. Number 18. Blue and John Crow Mountains National Park. Along Jamaica's eastern spine sits the island's first UNESCO World Heritage Site, inscribed in 2015 for both its biodiversity and its role as the last refuge of the windward maroons, formerly enslaved Africans who fought the British to a standstill from these ridgelines. Core zones of the park are restricted from casual access, specifically to protect old-growth cloud forest and endemic species found nowhere else on Earth, including the giant swallowtail, the largest butterfly in the Western Hemisphere. The terrain that made this the perfect gorilla stronghold 3 centuries ago, near vertical slopes, dense cloud cover, and almost no flat ground, is the same terrain that keeps most of the interior essentially inaccessible today, without a serious hike and a guide who actually knows the trails. Number 17. Morant Cays. Far off Jamaica's southeastern tip sit a handful of low, sun-blasted islands so remote that reaching them requires a serious open-water boat trip, and they've been declared a protected seabird sanctuary specifically because there's almost nothing else like them left. The waters around Morant Cays once supported a major conch fishery, but according to conservation researchers, that fishery has since been effectively wiped out by decades of overharvesting and poaching by foreign vessels. Jamaica's Coast Guard has only a handful of stations to patrol enormous stretches of open water, which means boats from neighboring countries have been documented lingering in these waters for days at a time, vacuuming the seafloor clean with industrial gear. The birds nesting on the cays are protected. The fish that used to surround them mostly aren't there anymore. Number 16. Pedro Cays, Pedro Bank. Roughly 60 kilometers off Jamaica's south coast lies Pedro Bank, a fishing ground nearly 2/3 the size of the entire Jamaican mainland. And in 2023, the government declared the cays and surrounding waters a protected area after decades of collapse. Conch harvesting here was banned outright in 2019 when a scientific assessment found the population was crashing, and it has only recently reopened under a strict seasonal quota with hard tonnage limits for industrial and small-scale fishers. A small transient community of fishers actually lives out on these remote sand cays for weeks at a time. Enforcement remains a genuine problem. Officials have reported catching poachers inside no fishing zones, fining them, and then finding the same people back in the sanctuary within a week, sometimes in a different boat entirely. Number 15. Kingston Harbor in Hunts Bay. At the western edge of one of the largest natural harbors in the world sits a stretch of water that scientists studying it have nicknamed the Dead Zone. Hunts Bay collects decades of industrial and landfill runoff, including seepage linked to the nearby Riverton City dump, and studies of cadmium levels found in the livers of Jamaicans have turned up concentrations second only to Japan, and nearly double those recorded in Australia, the UK, or Sweden. The bay sits directly beside dense residential communities in the corporate area, meaning hundreds of thousands of people live within a short drive of one of the most heavy metal contaminated bodies of water on the island, largely out of sight because it's tucked behind the industrial edge of Kingston's working harbor. Number 14. The Bauxite Red Mud Lakes. Jamaica is one of the world's great sources of bauxite, the ore aluminum is made from, and refining it leaves behind a caustic byproduct known locally as red mud, stored in enormous open-air impoundments that can stretch over a mile long and are visible from satellite imagery. Communities near lakes like Wendalco's site at Battersea in Manchester have complained for years about a smell residents describe as unbearable, with company representatives insisting the waste meets legal standards while residents insist the lake kills we. The danger isn't hypothetical. In 2021, a leak of hazardous caustic soda was detected at a Jamalco red mud pond in Clarendon after a liner failure, reportedly seeping toward the groundwater table before it was contained. Jamaica currently holds an estimated 130 million tons of this residue in storage, permanently. Number 13. Riverton City Dump. On the outskirts of Kingston sits Jamaica's largest and most notorious landfill, receiving more than 1,000 tons of solid waste a day, well past what it was ever built to hold. The dump has caught fire so many times that residents describe entire seasons defined by it. It burns every back-to-school time, every Christmas, and every Easter, in the words of one local. In March 2015, a blaze burned for over a week, blanketed Kingston in toxic smoke, and sent more than 600 people to public health facilities for smoke inhalation, according to the Medical Association of Jamaica. The government has repeatedly promised to close the site entirely, most recently as part of a 2022 60th Independence Anniversary announcement. But as of the most recent fires reported in 2026, Riverton is still burning and still operating. Number 12. Fort Augusta. Guarding the western mouth of Kingston Harbor since the 1750s, this 80-gun coastal fortress was built on a stinking mangrove peninsula once literally called Mosquito Point, at a brutal cost in worker lives during construction. In 1763, the fort's own gunpowder magazine, holding roughly 3,000 barrels, was struck by lightning. The explosion killed around 300 people and shattered windows as far as 17 miles away. From 1954 until 2017, the same fortress served as Jamaica's only prison for women, built to hold 250 inmates but at times crowding in nearly 300. The correctional wing has since closed, and the government has floated turning it into a halfway house for returning deportees, but the walls that once held enough gunpowder to level the harbor are still standing. Number 11. Tower Street Correctional Center. In downtown Kingston sits the General Penitentiary, Jamaica's oldest and highest security prison, and according to historical accounts of the site, it was originally used during the colonial era as holding ground for the transatlantic slave trade, complete with underground tunnels reportedly built to move captives through the facility unseen. Today, it remains a maximum security institution housing some of the country's most serious offenders, its old stone walls doing double duty as both a working prison and a physical remnant of one of the darkest chapters of Jamaica's colonial economy. Very little of the tunnel network is ever shown to the public, and the building's dual history, slave depot turned modern penitentiary, makes it one of the most quietly loaded pieces of real estate in the capital. Number 10. Goat Islands. Inside the Portland Bight Protected Area, Jamaica's largest protected zone, sit two small islands that in 2013 were nearly bulldozed into a $1.5 billion Chinese-built transshipment port. The plan would have leveled Great and Little Goat Islands entirely, dredging the largest mangrove system in Jamaica, home to the country's last wild population of the critically endangered Jamaican iguana and dozens of endemic bird species found nowhere else. A campaign called Save Goat Islands, led by the Jamaica Environment Trust, fought the proposal for 3 straight years. In 2016, the government scrapped the port. In 2017, the islands were formally declared a wildlife sanctuary instead. It's one of the few entries on this list where restricted means the bulldozers were stopped just in time, and the islands are now protected specifically so nothing like that plan can ever come back. Number 9. Port Royal. At the mouth of Kingston Harbor lies the only sunken city in the Western Hemisphere. On June 7, 1692, at almost exactly 11:43 in the morning, a massive earthquake liquefied the sandy peninsula beneath what was then called the wickedest city on Earth, and roughly 2/3 of the town slid straight down into the sea, taking around 2,000 people with it. Divers later recovered a pocket watch with its hands frozen at the moment of the disaster, giving archaeologists an almost unheard of precise timestamp for a catastrophe. Entire brick buildings, kitchens, and workshops still sit intact under 20 to 40 feet of water. Special government permission is required to dive the site at all, and it remains on UNESCO's tentative World Heritage List as one of the best preserved underwater colonial towns on the planet. Number 8. Pinnacle. In the hills of St. Catherine, Leonard Howe, the man widely credited as the founding father of the Rastafari movement, built the first Rastafarian commune in 1940 on 400 acres known as Pinnacle. Colonial police raided it repeatedly through the 1940s and 50s, viewing Howe's teachings as seditious. On May 26, 1954, a final government raid burned the ganja fields, torched the houses, and scattered the community for good. According to newspaper accounts from the time, officers seized over 3,000 British pounds in cash from the settlement, evidence of just how self-sufficient the commune had become before it was destroyed. Howe was eventually committed to a mental hospital, his followers dispersed across the island, and Pinnacle sat in ruins for decades before recently being restored as a Rastafarian heritage site. Number 7. Coral Gardens. On Holy Thursday, April 11, 1963, just a year after Jamaican independence, a land dispute in St. James exploded into violence when a group of Rastafarians burned down a gas station, leaving 8 people dead, including 2 policemen. Prime Minister Alexander Bustamante reportedly ordered police to bring in all Rastas, dead or alive. Over the next 2 days, more than 150 bearded men, assumed to be Rastafarians whether they had any connection to the incident or not, were rounded up across 3 parishes, beaten, and had their dreadlocks forcibly cut off. The event became known as Bad Friday. It took until April 2017, 54 years later, for the Jamaican government to formally apologize, calling its own actions a grave injustice, and to establish a trust fund for the aging survivors, some of whom are still alive today. Number 6. Cockpit Country and the Sovereign State of Accompong. In the rugged limestone interior of western Jamaica lies Cockpit Country, a 500 square mile karst landscape that supplies roughly 40% of the island's fresh water, and which the Accompong Maroons, descendants of a 1738 peace treaty with the British Crown, insist is not fully under Jamaican jurisdiction at all. Government-owned Naranda Bauxite has repeatedly been granted mining leases that stretch into the boundaries of the supposedly protected Cockpit Country protected area, prompting Maroon Chief Richard Curry to file a lawsuit against the Jamaican government itself, accusing it of trespassing on land his people never ceded. The Maroons operate under a self-declared government calling itself the Sovereign State of Accompong, complete with its own constitution, and while Jamaica does not recognize this claim, it also hasn't been able to make the standoff go away. Number 5. Nanny Town. High in the Blue Mountains, at the source of the Stony River and accessible only by a treacherous climb, sit the ruins of the original stronghold of the Windward Maroons, founded around 1700 under the leadership of Queen Nanny, Jamaica's only female national hero. Nanny Town was built on a 900-foot ridge specifically because it made a surprise British attack almost impossible, and for years the colonial militia would capture the town, only to have the Maroons retake it almost immediately. British forces finally destroyed it in 1734. The site was essentially lost to the jungle for 2 centuries until an expedition rediscovered the buried remains. Today it sits deep inside restricted wilderness within the national park, reachable only by a serious multi-day trek, still regarded by Maroon communities as sacred ground. Number 4. Moortown and the Bump Grave. After the 1739 peace treaty ended the First Maroon War, Queen Nanny established New Nanny Town on a 500-acre land grant in the Rio Grande Valley, which grew into what is now called Moortown, the living capital of the Windward Maroons. At its center sits the Bump Grave, believed to be Nanny's actual burial site, a place still treated as sacred ground and central to Maroon spiritual life today. The community continues to communicate across the surrounding valleys using the abeng, a cow horn instrument once used to summon Maroon warriors during the war itself. Outsiders are welcomed for cultural events, but access to certain ceremonial areas and the deeper interior of Maroon lands still runs through community protocol rather than any national park office, more than 280 years after the treaty was signed. Number 3. Trenchtown and Denham Town. In inner-city West Kingston sit some of the most storied and most volatile neighborhoods on the island, communities immortalized by Bob Marley's lyric about a government yard in Trenchtown, and simultaneously marked, for decades, by cycles of political garrison violence tied to Jamaica's 2 dominant parties. These garrison communities emerged from mid-20th century housing schemes that became so tightly aligned with a single political party that opposing candidates, and sometimes opposing residents, were effectively shut out. The same West Kingston streets that produced reggae's most iconic songwriting also became flashpoints during periods of election season unrest for much of Jamaica's post-independence history. Culture Yard, the small complex where Marley lived early in his career, still sits inside this same tightly knit, historically guarded stretch of the city. Number 2. The Gun Court. In 1974, after a wave of killings targeting lawyers and businessmen, Prime Minister Michael Manley's government pushed through the Gun Court Act, creating a special court with the power to try firearms cases in camera, meaning without the public or press present and without a jury. A conviction originally carried a mandatory sentence of indefinite detention. Time magazine covered the resulting compound at South Camp in Kingston under the headline, Stalag in Kingston. The law worked so aggressively against Jamaica's constitutional protections that in 1975 Britain's Privy Council, then Jamaica's final court of appeal, struck down key parts of it as unconstitutional, forcing Parliament to replace indefinite detention with a mandatory life sentence instead. More than 50 years later, firearms cases in Jamaica are still automatically routed into gun court proceedings, and debates over reforming the in-camera rule continue in Jamaican newspapers to this day. Number 1. Tivoli Gardens. On May 24, 2010, roughly 800 soldiers and 370 police officers stormed into Tivoli Gardens, a densely packed West Kingston garrison community, in an attempt to arrest Christopher Dudas Koch, a local strongman the United States wanted extradited on drug and gun trafficking charges. Koch had run the neighborhood almost like a shadow government for nearly 2 decades, so completely that residents say the power company never dared enter to disconnect illegal electricity hookups. The operation, known as the Tivoli incursion, lasted 4 days. When it was over, at least 69 civilians and 3 members of the security forces were dead, though community members and independent researchers have long argued the real toll may run into the hundreds. International forensic pathologists were brought in to observe the autopsies. No one was ever held legally accountable for how the civilians died. Koch himself slipped away during the raid and wasn't captured until nearly a month later, disguised as a woman, on his way, he claimed, to turn himself in at the US Embassy. He's currently serving a 23-year sentence in the United States. In Tivoli Gardens itself, the bullet holes are still visible on the apartment blocks, and some residents still refer to Koch as the president. What about the most restricted places in every other Caribbean island?